The night was still. The lights of Anaheim Hills flickered like distant fireflies, and the occasional hum of passing cars filled the quiet suburban air. Inside one of the elegant, well-manicured homes, a storm was brewing. A muffled argument echoed through the halls, bouncing off the polished wooden floors and the pristine walls. It was not an unfamiliar sound in this household. The voices belonged to Jeffrey Ferguson, a respected judge, and his wife, Cheryl Ferguson, a woman whose patience had been worn thin over the years. The tension had been simmering for months, perhaps years. Small disagreements had turned into heated debates, and those debates had evolved into full-blown battles. Tonight was no different. The only difference was the gun. Then, a single gunshot. The sound tore through the silence, louder than anything that had come before. It reverberated through the house, rattling picture frames, sending an eerie chill down the spine of anyone who might have been awake to hear it. And then, stillness. For a few long, agonizing seconds, nothing moved. The walls stood witness to something irreversible. The house, once a place of comfort and routine, had become a crime scene. A door creaked open upstairs. Their son, barely awake, stumbled out of his room. His heart pounded in his chest as he followed a terrible instinct, stepping cautiously toward the staircase. Every fiber of his being told him something was wrong. When he reached the bottom of the stairs, his breath hitched. His mother lay motionless on the floor. A red stain was spreading across the fabric of her blouse, pooling beneath her like an ink blot seeping into paper. Her eyes were open but vacant, her body unnaturally still. Something was missing from her expression, the life. And standing there frozen was Jeffrey Ferguson. His hands trembled. His face was pale, his expression unreadable. Somewhere between shock and emptiness, the air smelled like gunpowder. A gun lay a few feet away on the polished floor, its presence as stark as a blade left in the wake of a battlefield. The room felt suspended in time. Then, motion. Jeffrey pulled out his phone with unsteady hands, his fingers moving almost automatically. He typed out a message, his thoughts unclear, but his actions driven by instinct. "I lost it. I just shot my wife." He hit send. The message flew into the digital void, reaching its recipients, his court clerk, his colleagues, the police. The first responders arrived minutes later. Sirens cut through the California night. Flashing red and blue lights bathed the front yard in a relentless pulse, illuminating the scene inside. Officers stormed in, weapons drawn, their presence authoritative yet uncertain. They found Jeffrey standing still, the weight of the moment pressing down on him like an unmovable force. His son's cries filled the air. His wife lay on the floor beyond help. And the gun, his gun, was just within reach. The officers didn't hesitate. "Step back," one of them ordered. Jeffrey complied without resistance. He raised his hands, his face unreadable. "Is she?" One of the officers hesitated. A paramedic rushed forward, knelt beside the body. A quick assessment. No pulse. The confirmation came seconds later. Cheryl Ferguson was gone. One of the officers stepped toward Jeffrey. "Sir, we're going to need you to come with us." For the first time since the shot was fired, his expression shifted. He looked up at the officers, his mouth slightly open as if searching for the right words. But no words came. He simply nodded. And just like that, the judge became the accused. The house, once filled with warmth and mundane routine, now stood as a grim monument to tragedy. The scent of gunpowder lingered in the air, mingling with the faint remnants of perfume and dinner that had long gone cold. The flashing lights from the patrol cars outside cast eerie shadows through the tall windows, flickering like ghosts against the walls. Crime scene investigators moved methodically through the house, their gloved hands careful not to disturb what could be crucial evidence. Officers secured the perimeter, their radios crackling with hushed conversations, dispatch updates, and procedural confirmations. This was no ordinary domestic dispute. This was now a homicide investigation. Jeffrey Ferguson, the man who had presided over countless criminal cases, sat on a wooden chair in his own living room, silent. The very same man who had once passed judgment on others was now sitting under the scrutinizing eyes of law enforcement. His hands rested on his lap, no longer trembling, no longer reaching for his phone. He stared at nothing in particular, his breath shallow, his expression unreadable. The responding officers exchanged uneasy glances. There was something deeply unsettling about seeing a judge, a man who was supposed to uphold the law, sitting in the middle of a crime scene like this. Some of them had stood before him in court, had heard his rulings, had respected his authority. Now he looked like any other suspect. A forensic technician knelt beside Cheryl's body, taking careful photographs, noting every detail, the way her body had collapsed, the unnatural stillness of her limbs, the blood pooling beneath her. The entry wound was clean, precise. The trajectory suggested the shot had been fired at close range, too close for it to be accidental. The gun lay a few feet away from her body, partially resting on the edge of an ornate rug. It was a Glock 21, a weapon Jeffrey was known to carry. As a judge handling violent cases, he had been granted a concealed carry permit. He had owned this gun for years. But why was it there? The positioning of the firearm was the first red flag. It hadn't fallen from a trembling hand. It had been placed, or worse, moved. The inconsistencies were subtle but undeniable. A lead investigator, Detective Laura Martinez, entered the scene, her sharp eyes scanning the room with the precision of someone who had seen too many crime scenes, yet never let the horror become routine. She did not believe in coincidences. She examined the positioning of the body, the blood splatter, the placement of the weapon. Something was off. Moving past the stunned officers, she crouched near the gun and carefully bagged it for testing. If there were fingerprints, if there was gunpowder residue, the forensic team would find it. But a creeping thought settled in her mind. Was this really as straightforward as it seemed? Her gaze drifted to Jeffrey Ferguson. He was still motionless, still quiet. A man caught between reality and whatever thought loop had overtaken his mind. She had interrogated countless suspects before, had seen every kind of reaction, screaming denials, frantic justifications, crocodile tears. But this kind of detachment unsettled her. She broke the silence. "Judge Ferguson, can you tell me what happened?" He blinked as if surfacing from deep underwater. His voice, when it came, was hoarse and distant. "It was an accident." An accident. That word hung in the air like a fog, thick and unconvincing. Detective Martinez didn't respond immediately. She had learned long ago that silence could be just as powerful as interrogation. She simply let the moment stretch, watching his reaction, waiting for him to fill the void with something more. He didn't. Instead, his gaze remained unfocused, his breathing measured, as if he was trying to convince himself that the words he had just spoken were true. She shifted her focus to the son, the only other person in the house at the time of the shooting. The young man sat on the stairs, his body curled in on itself, his hands gripping his knees. His face was pale, his eyes red and swollen. He had been the first to see the body, the first to see his father standing there, unarmed but guilty in ways beyond just holding a weapon. "Did you hear the shot?" Martinez asked. He swallowed hard, nodded. His voice was barely above a whisper. "Yes," she pressed gently. "And before that?" A long pause, a hesitation. Then, "They were fighting." That was expected. They had been fighting for years, but something in his voice made her lean in. "And?" A beat. She told him she was leaving. The words cut through the air. It wasn't just another argument. This had been the end of something. Martinez exchanged glances with her team. The timeline was shifting. This wasn't an isolated moment of rage. This had a buildup, a breaking point. What happened between that announcement and the pulling of the trigger? She turned back to Jeffrey, whose fingers had curled slightly into his palms at the words. The only visible reaction he had given. His wife had wanted to leave him, and now she was dead. Coincidence? Unlikely. The Ferguson household had always projected an image of success. A well-respected judge, a devoted wife, a beautiful home in an affluent neighborhood. On the surface, it was the American dream. But the walls of that house, the very structure that had stood firm for years, held secrets that had never been spoken aloud. The investigation into Cheryl Ferguson's death had barely begun, yet already the perfect facade of their marriage was starting to crack. People whispered about trouble, about tension that had simmered beneath the surface for years. To outsiders, they had been the picture of stability, but to those who knew them well, the truth was far messier. Detective Laura Martinez sat at her desk in the station, reviewing interview transcripts. Witnesses had painted a picture of a woman who had spent years trapped in something she could no longer endure, and a man who had spent just as long trying to maintain control. It was clear that Cheryl Ferguson had not been happy, that she had felt something closing in around her, something she could no longer ignore. Friends had described her as exhausted, worn down, and in recent months, distant. She had started withdrawing from social gatherings, had stopped talking about Jeffrey the way she used to. In quiet moments when she thought no one was listening, she had voiced concerns that no one had fully understood at the time. She had been planning to leave. There had been emails to an attorney, messages exchanged with close friends, in which she had confided her fears. Divorce was no longer just an idea floating in the back of her mind. It had been a decision, and it was a decision she had planned to act on. The night she died, she had texted a friend just hours before the gunshot rang out. "I'm telling him tonight. It's time." She never sent another message after that. The investigators had learned that the Fergusons had dinner together that evening, at a quiet, upscale restaurant. Witnesses recalled no outward signs of trouble, no raised voices, no obvious tension, just a couple sharing a meal. But the people closest to them knew that the most dangerous fights were not always the ones that happened in public. Cheryl had likely waited until they were home to tell him what she had been holding inside. She had likely measured her words carefully, perhaps hoping for a civil conversation, perhaps hoping for understanding. But whatever she had anticipated, it was unlikely she had expected a gun to be involved. A pattern had begun to emerge in Jeffrey Ferguson's life, one that had not been visible to the public eye, but one that now, under the scrutiny of a homicide investigation, was impossible to ignore. Jeffrey Ferguson drank, not the way most men did, not in bars, not in reckless, public displays of excess. His drinking was controlled, methodical. It was the kind of habit that built itself into a man's routine so seamlessly that it no longer felt like indulgence, but necessity. He drank just enough to loosen his tongue, just enough to dull the edges of his frustration, just enough to erode the restraints that had kept his anger in check for so long. People close to Cheryl had known. They had seen the change in her over the years. They had noticed the way she spoke about him with caution, how her laughter had faded, how the weight of something unspoken had settled into her shoulders. She had hinted at it before, in small, nearly imperceptible ways. When he drinks, he's not the same. The phrase had echoed through multiple witness interviews, a subtle but chilling thread that wove itself through the investigation. The night she died, had he been drinking? The empty glass found in their kitchen suggested that he had. It had been placed neatly on the counter, next to a half-empty bottle of bourbon, as if it were part of a familiar routine. Martinez knew from experience that alcohol had a way of making things worse. It had a way of turning minor arguments into something explosive, a way of bringing out the worst in people who already carried too much anger inside them. If Cheryl had told him that night that she was leaving, if she had stood in front of him and said that she was done, that she was walking away from everything they had built, how had he reacted? The case was no longer simple. It was no longer just a question of who pulled the trigger. It was a question of how long this moment had been coming. The forensic report would reveal more in the coming days. The autopsy would confirm the angle of the gunshot, the trajectory of the bullet, whether it had been fired in a struggle or whether it had been deliberate. But already the pieces were beginning to fall into place. There was no sign of forced entry. There was no sign of a third party. The only two people in that house at the time of the shooting were Cheryl and Jeffrey Ferguson, and only one of them was alive to tell the story. But the evidence would speak, even if Jeffrey remained silent. The sterile air of the Orange County Crime Lab carried a weight of anticipation as forensic specialists worked methodically under the bright, unyielding lights. Each movement, each calculation, each carefully measured step in the examination process could determine whether this was truly an accident or something far more deliberate. The tension in the lab was thick, the kind of tension that came with cases involving high-profile figures, especially when the accused was someone who had spent his entire career passing judgment on others. Detective Laura Martinez stood just outside the lab, arms crossed, watching the forensic team comb through the firearm recovered at the crime scene. The Glock 21, now sealed in an evidence bag, rested on a stainless steel table, its matte black surface seemingly indifferent to the chaos it had caused. Martinez knew better than to assume that an object was just an object. Guns told stories. This one just needed the right person to listen. The first results came in: gunshot residue tests. It was standard procedure, but the implications were always significant. If Jeffrey Ferguson had fired that gun, there would be trace amounts of burnt particles on his hands, his clothes, even his skin. The results confirmed the obvious. He had fired a gun that night, but it wasn't the presence of residue that caught Martinez's attention. It was where it was missing. There were only trace amounts on his dominant hand. That was unusual. In most cases where a suspect had fired at close range, there would be a significant concentration of gunshot residue on both hands, and especially given the close proximity to the victim. The residue on Ferguson's hands was far less than expected. Something wasn't right. Another technician approached Martinez with additional findings. The crime scene photos had been cross-examined, and while everything initially appeared consistent with a domestic dispute turned deadly, one crucial detail refused to align with Jeffrey's story: the blood spatter pattern. Blood doesn't lie. It moves according to physics, reacting to force, velocity, and impact. The victim's wound indicated that she had been shot at close range, a fact already confirmed by the autopsy report. However, the blood spatter told a different story. The expected pattern, a high-velocity mist radiating outward from the wound, consistent with a gunshot at point-blank range, was not entirely present. Instead, the blood had pooled too neatly, as though something had interrupted the flow. More importantly, there were unaccounted for secondary droplets, the kind that suggested movement immediately following the shot. This meant that either the victim had been moved post-mortem or something had obstructed the blood spray. If the shot had truly been an accident, a spontaneous moment of violence during an argument, there would have been a much clearer trajectory of blood mist surrounding the scene. Instead, there was anomalous spatter along the lower cabinets, but very little on Jeffrey's clothing. He had been close enough to fire the shot, but if that was the case, why wasn't he covered in more blood? Martinez took a slow breath, letting the findings settle. This was the kind of inconsistency that turned an open and shut case into a puzzle. It meant something had been altered. And then came the third piece of the puzzle: fingerprint analysis on the gun. The forensic team had run a comprehensive scan, analyzing the ridges and pressure points. The results were unexpected. Yes, Jeffrey Ferguson's prints were on the weapon. That much was obvious. He had admitted to handling it. But there was something else. Another set of prints. Smudged, faint, but present, and they didn't belong to Jeffrey. Martinez stiffened, staring at the report. The new set of prints wasn't a match in the system, which meant one of two things. Either it belonged to someone without a criminal record, or it had been too faint to generate a viable match. Either way, it changed everything. If Jeffrey Ferguson had been the only one to hold the gun, there wouldn't have been partial, unidentifiable prints in places inconsistent with normal handling. That suggested one disturbing possibility. Someone else had touched that gun before or after the shooting. That wasn't supposed to happen in a crime like this. If a husband shot his wife in the heat of the moment, the gun was in his control, period. No one else should have had their hands on it. Martinez's mind raced. Had someone else been in that house? Had someone interfered with the scene? Had Jeffrey covered for something he wasn't ready to admit? The forensic evidence had turned what was supposed to be a straightforward case into a growing storm of unanswered questions. The gunshot residue wasn't heavy enough. The blood spatter didn't fully match. The prints weren't completely his. Martinez clenched her jaw, staring at the growing case file in front of her. The weight of something bigger pressed against her instincts, a creeping certainty that the truth of what had happened that night wasn't nearly as simple as it seemed. The interrogation room was sterile, almost claustrophobic, the kind of space designed to unravel a person's defenses, to strip them of the certainties they carried outside of these walls. The walls were a muted gray, the lighting harsh but strategically placed to create an air of discomfort, pressing in on those who sat across the steel table. There were no distractions here, no framed degrees on the walls, no furniture to sink into, no comforts to make a man feel safe. There was only the silence, the cold chair beneath them, and the weight of the accusations pressing in from all directions. Jeffrey Ferguson sat there now, his fingers laced together, his jaw set in a way that suggested determination, though the lines on his face betrayed something else, fatigue perhaps, or the slow realization that his version of events was beginning to fall apart. He had been in countless courtrooms, had listened to men and women attempt to justify their actions under scrutiny, had delivered sentences with the calculated precision of a man who believed in the law. But now he was the one sitting under the microscope, and the irony of it was not lost on anyone in the room. Detective Laura Martinez leaned forward slightly, the case file resting in front of her, thick with the weight of evidence that had been accumulating since the night of the shooting. She had learned over the years that people often convicted themselves without realizing it. The truth, when it was something a person desperately wanted to avoid, had a way of slipping through the cracks. She didn't have to pressure him. She only had to wait. "We need to go over your statement again," she said finally, flipping open the file. "I want to make sure we have everything exactly as it happened." Jeffrey's eyes flickered to the file for a split second before settling back into the carefully measured neutrality he had maintained since the moment he had been taken in. He had been cooperative, but cooperation did not mean transparency. He had stuck to his version of events with a determination that had, at first, seemed reasonable, but now in the light of new findings, that version had started to unravel. "I already told you what happened," he said, his voice steady but devoid of the authority it once carried in a courtroom. "We had an argument. She was upset. I don't even remember reaching for the gun. It just happened." Martinez studied him for a moment, letting the words settle between them. There was nothing inherently strange about what he had said. Many people who committed crimes of passion described the moment in a haze, as though their minds had momentarily disconnected from their bodies. But the problem was, the evidence did not align with a spontaneous act of violence. She flipped to the forensic report and slid it across the table toward him, watching his reaction closely. "There's something we need to discuss," she said, tapping the page with her fingernail. "The gunshot residue on your hands. It's lighter than we'd expect for someone who fired a close-range shot." His expression didn't change, but she caught the subtle movement of his throat as he swallowed. "That doesn't mean anything," he said. "Maybe I washed my hands after. Maybe I—" There's also something strange about the blood spatter. The interruption was deliberate, precise. She had seen too many suspects try to regain control of a conversation by offering explanations before the real question was even asked. This wasn't a man recalling a traumatic event. This was a man trying to preemptively defend himself. She pressed on. "If you were standing as close as you say you were when the shot was fired, you should have had significantly more blood on your clothing," she continued. "But you didn't. And then there's this." She turned another page and placed it in front of him. A close-up photograph of the Glock 21, dusted for fingerprints. "There were partial prints on the gun," she said, watching him closely. "Not just yours." For the first time, a flicker of something crossed his face. It was gone almost as soon as it appeared, but she had seen it. The moment of calculation, the brief but undeniable reaction to a fact he had not anticipated. "That's impossible," he said after a beat, but the words lacked conviction. "Is it?" Martinez asked. "Because right now, we have a problem. You're saying this was an accident, but the evidence suggests there was a moment after the shooting where something changed. The gun wasn't immediately dropped. It was handled, possibly moved, and someone else touched it." Silence stretched between them. Jeffrey looked down at his hands for the briefest of moments before exhaling slowly, as if trying to contain something that threatened to escape. "I don't know what to tell you," he said finally. "I was in shock. Maybe I moved it without realizing it." Martinez didn't push further, not yet. Instead, she let the silence return, let the weight of the inconsistency settle in. He wasn't going to confess, not outright, but cracks were beginning to form. After a few beats, she closed the file and stood. "We'll talk again soon," she said, pushing the chair back. "In the meantime, think about what you want to say. Because the story you've told us so far, it's not holding up." She left him sitting there, staring at the table, as the truth continued to tighten its grip around him. The air in the Orange County Crime Lab was thick with the sterile scent of disinfectant and the faint hum of high-powered machines processing evidence. It was the kind of environment where science reigned supreme, where cold, hard facts replaced human emotion, where cases weren't decided by gut instinct, but by data, chemical traces, and microscopic details invisible to the naked eye. And yet, as Detective Laura Martinez stood at the edge of the lab, watching forensic analysts pore over the latest batch of findings, she couldn't shake the creeping unease settling into her bones. The evidence was talking, whispering fragments of a truth that was still just out of reach. A puzzle missing its final, damning piece. The second set of fingerprints found on the Glock 21 had been run through every available database. No match. That meant one of two things. Either the prints belonged to someone with no criminal record, someone who had never been booked, never had their identity entered into law enforcement systems, or they had been too faint to generate a clear result. Either way, it wasn't Jeffrey Ferguson's exclusive print on the weapon. That, combined with the inconsistencies in his gunshot residue levels and the questionable blood spatter patterns, painted a picture of something far murkier than a simple domestic dispute turned violent. If this had been a crime of passion, committed in the heat of an argument, the physical evidence should have been straightforward. There should have been uncontested proof that Jeffrey was the only one who had handled the weapon before or after the shot. But there wasn't. Martinez studied the forensics report again, the words printed in neat clinical text, devoid of emotion, yet holding the weight of a revelation. The blood spatter had been disrupted, not in a way that could be easily dismissed as a natural consequence of movement, but in a way that suggested deliberate interference. Someone had been in that room after Cheryl was shot, someone had touched the gun, had been close enough to leave fingerprints, had altered something. But who and why? Her gut told her that this wasn't about a single moment of anger spiraling into murder. This was something bigger, something more calculated, something that had been set in motion long before the gunshot had echoed through that house. Cheryl Ferguson had been planning to leave her husband. That much was no longer in question. The text messages, the legal consultations, the financial inquiries. She had been laying the groundwork for her exit, for severing ties with a man who, to the outside world, seemed powerful and controlled, but behind closed doors had long since become something else entirely. A woman does not wake up one day and decide to walk away from a life she has built for over 30 years without a reason. She had been afraid of something. Martinez knew that in cases like these, there was always a moment, a catalyst, a final push that turned quiet discontent into desperate action. If Cheryl had reached her breaking point, if she had decided that she couldn't stay another day in that house, had she confided in someone? Had she told someone what she was planning, what she feared might happen? The answer came in the form of an overlooked detail, a second phone. It had been recovered from the crime scene, tucked away in a bedside drawer, powered off, its presence unnoticed in the initial sweep. Only after forensic techs conducted a deeper search did they find it. It was not registered under Cheryl Ferguson's name, nor was it linked to any account the investigators had initially searched. It was a burner phone, and it had been used frequently. Martinez felt a sharp pulse of adrenaline as she flipped through the logs, scrolling through dozens of messages, all from one unknown number. The texts weren't casual. They weren't friendly banter or idle conversation. They were carefully worded, deliberate exchanges that suggested secrecy, urgency, even fear. Did you talk to him yet? You need to be careful. You know what he's capable of. If you're leaving, make sure you have everything ready first. The last message was dated the night of the murder. Don't do it alone. The weight of those words settled in Martinez's chest like a stone. Someone knew. Someone had been guiding her, warning her, maybe even protecting her. But who? And more importantly, had they been there that night? Had they tried to intervene? Had they been the one to touch the gun? The implications were staggering. If this unknown contact had been involved in Cheryl's plans, if they had known she was leaving, if they had been worried about what Jeffrey might do, were they trying to stop something before it happened? Or were they trying to cover something after it was too late? Martinez straightened, gripping the burner phone tightly. This case had just shifted again. Jeffrey Ferguson was still the man in the interrogation room. But maybe, just maybe, He wasn't the only one who knew what had happened that night. The burner phone sat on the evidence table, its sleek, unremarkable design masking the weight of what it contained. It was a cheap, disposable model, the kind that left no paper trail, no contract, no way to easily trace ownership. It had been tucked away in a bedside drawer, powered off at the time of discovery, unnoticed during the initial search. Only now was it revealing its significance, its messages telling a story that had remained in the shadows, hidden from those who had only been looking at the obvious. Detective Laura Martinez sat in the dim glow of her desk lamp, the light casting long shadows against the walls of the precinct's homicide division. The evidence file was open in front of her, pages spread out in careful disorder, each one a fragment of the growing, tangled narrative. The text messages on the burner phone had changed everything. They had introduced a ghost in the machine, an unknown presence in this case, someone who had been intimately aware of Cheryl Ferguson's fears, someone who had been warning her, urging her to be careful, perhaps even instructing her on what to do next. The phone records confirmed that the messages had been sent from an unregistered number, bouncing through multiple cell towers, likely using a prepaid SIM card, making it nearly impossible to trace through traditional means. Whoever had sent those messages had known exactly what they were doing. Martinez drummed her fingers against the table, her thoughts racing. This wasn't just a bystander offering support. The phrasing of the messages, the urgency behind them, the insistence that Cheryl take precautions, all of it suggested that this person hadn't just been concerned, they had been expecting something to happen. That was the part that stuck with her. Had this unknown contact anticipated violence? Had they known that Cheryl was in danger? Or worse, had they been there when it happened? The question loomed over her like a specter, heavy and insistent. There were too many unanswered questions. The unknown caller wasn't just an observer. They were a participant in the unraveling of Cheryl Ferguson's life. Martinez turned her attention to the tech team working on the phone's data retrieval. While the messages themselves were invaluable, the true breakthrough could come from pinpointing the last known location of the sender. Burner phones didn't leave a financial paper trail, but they still pinged towers, still left behind breadcrumbs in the digital ether. A call had been placed from the unknown number just hours before Cheryl Ferguson was killed. Not a text, but a voice call. It lasted 42 seconds, and it had been made from within the same neighborhood where the Fergusons lived. Martinez's pulse quickened. The number hadn't just been some distant correspondent reaching out to Cheryl from the safety of anonymity. They had been close, physically close. She stood abruptly, pushing away from her desk. She needed to see Ferguson's neighborhood again, needed to stand in that space with this new information in mind. There had been no reported visitors that night, no surveillance footage showing an unfamiliar vehicle pulling up to the house. If someone had been there, they had either arrived on foot or had been careful enough to avoid detection, or they had already been inside the house. That thought sent a cold ripple down her spine. When she pulled up to the Ferguson residence, the crime scene tape still fluttered in the night breeze, a stark reminder that this was no longer just a house. It was evidence. The property was silent, the towering hedges casting long, jagged shadows under the dim glow of streetlights. The neighbors had long since stopped lingering outside, no longer whispering in hushed voices about what had happened here. They had returned to their routines, but the ghost of that fatal night still clung to the walls, to the carefully maintained flower beds, to the air itself. She stepped past the threshold, into the house where the last moments of Cheryl Ferguson's life had played out, and where, perhaps, someone else had been watching. There was something she had been missing, something buried in the details. The phone call, the hidden prints on the gun, the disrupted blood spatter. The pieces weren't coming together the way they should have in a cut-and-dry domestic homicide. The text messages from the burner phone had been clear. Don't do it alone. Had someone else been in this house the night of the murder? Had they seen what happened? Had they... Her thoughts were interrupted by the forensic report update flashing onto her phone screen. The blood work results had come back from the lab, and there it was, a second DNA profile. Not just Jeffrey Ferguson's, not just Cheryl Ferguson's, someone else's, and it wasn't accounted for. The unknown caller wasn't just a concerned friend. They had been here. The weight of a secret is never evenly distributed. It presses harder on some than others, warping their sense of reality, altering their actions, shaping their futures in ways they never expected. And in the case of Cheryl Ferguson's murder, it was becoming increasingly clear that someone had been carrying the burden of knowing too much. Detective Laura Martinez had spent years unraveling crimes, chasing ghosts through evidence, following whispers that led to killers who believed they had outsmarted the system. But this case, it was different. The evidence wasn't just leading to a single perpetrator. It was pointing towards something bigger, something hidden beneath layers of misdirection and silence. The forensic report confirming the presence of a second DNA profile at the crime scene had sent a jolt through the investigation. Until now, the focus had been entirely on Jeffrey Ferguson, his story, his version of events, his potential guilt. And yet, the deeper they dug, the more they found traces of someone else, someone who had been physically present the night Cheryl died, someone who had walked through the blood and left behind a piece of themselves. And they had been silent. The unknown caller was no longer just a shadow in the background of Cheryl's final days. They were there. The question was, why hadn't they come forward? Martinez stood over the forensic evidence table, staring at the sealed swab sample labeled Unknown DNA Crime Scene. The lab techs had done their part, extracting a partial genetic profile, but without a match in any criminal database, they were left with only one path forward: family genealogy tracing. It was a slow process, one that relied on voluntary participation from ancestry databases, on the luck of finding a distant relative who had submitted their DNA to track their heritage. But in recent years, it had led to breakthroughs in cases that had been cold for decades. This case wasn't cold. It was burning. The lead technician looked up from his computer, his fingers hesitating over the keyboard. "We got a partial match," he said. "It's distant, but it's something. The unknown DNA shares markers with someone in a genealogy database." Martinez leaned in. A partial match meant family, not the person themselves, but a relative, a cousin, a sibling, a bloodline connection that could lead them to the silent witness. The match had come from a man in his 60s who had submitted his DNA for heritage testing years ago. The probability of relation was high enough that the unknown DNA belonged to someone in his immediate family. Martinez exhaled, already running through the possibilities. A son, a nephew, a brother. Whoever they were tied to this case by blood and by silence. The search led them to a name: Ryan Kessler, 34 years old, no criminal record, no known connection to the Fergusons. Yet his genetic markers placed him directly in the family line of the DNA found at the crime scene, and he had been in Anaheim Hills the night of the murder. The discovery sent a ripple through the precinct. Detectives scrambled to confirm his whereabouts, to track his digital footprint. The burner phone's last known location had been traced to the same cell tower his personal phone had connected to the night of the crime. Ryan Kessler wasn't just related to the DNA sample. He had been in the area. Martinez's mind raced. Who was he to Cheryl? Why had his DNA been at the scene? Was he a witness, a participant, an accomplice? The deeper they dug, the more questions emerged. Kessler had no history with law enforcement, no criminal ties, no record of violence. And yet, he had been close enough to leave evidence behind. Had Cheryl confided in him? Had she reached out to him in the days leading up to her death? Or had he been there for another reason? Martinez pressed her fingers to her temple, feeling the weight of the case pressed down on her. Every answer brought more uncertainty. Every lead opened another door to something more complicated than what they had originally believed. The truth was no longer just about Jeffrey Ferguson's guilt or innocence. The truth was that someone else had been in that house, and they knew what really happened that night. The air inside the Anaheim Hills precinct was thick with the kind of tension that came when an investigation that had seemed open and shut began to fracture under the weight of new evidence. Detective Laura Martinez had been chasing ghosts in this case, tracing patterns in blood spatter, analyzing fingerprints that shouldn't have been there, listening to the silence of a missing witness who had never come forward. But now she had a name: Ryan Kessler. The DNA found at the scene had led them to him, a man with no criminal record, no known ties to Jeffrey or Cheryl Ferguson. A man who had been near the Ferguson residence on the night of the murder, whose phone had connected to the same cell tower that had received a burner phone message warning Cheryl not to do it alone. Yet he had remained silent, hadn't spoken a word. The first step was to find him. Martinez's team worked methodically, combing through Kessler's records, his digital footprint, his financial transactions. There were no glaring red flags, no evidence that he had been stalking Cheryl, no signs of aggression or threats. Instead, what emerged was a far more subtle, far more unnerving pattern. Kessler had been in the background of Cheryl Ferguson's life for months. His name didn't appear in any formal records tied to her, but his movements told a different story. He had been seen near places she frequented. His phone had connected to towers near her gym, near her workplace, near the coffee shop where she had been meeting with her divorce attorney. It wasn't enough to call him a stalker, but it was enough to call him a presence. The last confirmed sighting of him was 2 days after the murder. Security footage from a gas station in a neighboring city showed him standing at a pump, looking over his shoulder, tense, as if waiting for something to happen. He had paid in cash, and then he had disappeared. Martinez felt the weight of the case pressing harder against her ribs. The man was a ghost. No financial transactions after that. No phone pings. No traceable movements. He had either gone off the grid or someone had helped him disappear. And that raised the most dangerous question of all. Was he running because he was guilty or because he had seen something he wasn't supposed to? The precinct was humming with quiet urgency when a junior detective approached Martinez, dropping a printed report onto her desk. "You're going to want to see this," he said. The report was a bank transaction record. It was Cheryl Ferguson's. Her financial records had already been combed through as part of the standard investigation, but this one had slipped through. A withdrawal made 2 days before her death. $10,000. In cash. Martinez felt her pulse quicken. This wasn't an accidental transaction. A woman planning to leave her husband, a woman who had been warned not to do it alone, pulling out that amount of money right before she was killed. She hadn't been just preparing to leave. She had been preparing to pay someone. Martinez flipped through the files, her brain piecing together the puzzle at a rapid pace. Had Cheryl been hiring protection? Had she reached out to Kessler because she had been afraid of what Jeffrey might do? Or had Kessler been blackmailing her? There were two possibilities, and both led to dangerous conclusions. Either Kessler had been meant to protect her and failed, or he had been part of what led to her death. Either way, he was the missing link. The silence surrounding him wasn't just suspicious, it was deadly. The rain fell in cold sheets over Anaheim Hills, drumming against the pavement in a steady rhythm as Detective Laura Martinez sat in her unmarked car, watching the dimly lit motel across the street. The flickering neon sign read vacancy, its weak glow barely cutting through the mist clinging to the streets. It was the kind of place where people disappeared, where cash was the only currency accepted, where names weren't required as long as the money was good. And tonight, it was the place where Ryan Kessler had finally surfaced. Tracking him had been a nightmare. He had dropped off the grid after the night of Cheryl Ferguson's murder, leaving behind nothing but unanswered questions and a trail of suspicion. But a routine search of known transient motels had paid off. His name hadn't been used, but his face had shown up on a security camera. He had checked in alone, nervous, looking over his shoulder. He had been running from something, but was he running from what he had done or from what he had seen? Martinez flexed her fingers against the steering wheel, her breath steady, waiting. Kessler had stayed hidden for days, but fear made people sloppy. It made them desperate, and desperate men made mistakes. The moment came minutes later, a shadow moving behind the thin curtains of room 16, a flicker of movement, the brief glow of a phone screen illuminating a face. He was inside. The time for waiting was over. Martinez stepped out into the rain, the cold biting against her skin as she signaled to her team. They moved in fast and clean, surrounding the motel room with quiet precision. Within seconds, a knock echoed through the night. "Ryan Kessler, this is Detective Martinez. We need to talk." Silence. Then, movement. The shifting of footsteps, hesitation. He was considering his options. Martinez knocked again. "You can open the door now, or we can break it down. Either way, we're not leaving." A pause, then finally, the click of the lock. The door opened just enough to reveal a man who looked like he had spent the past week unraveling at the seams. His clothes were wrinkled, his beard unkempt, his eyes dark and hollowed by exhaustion. But more than anything else, Martinez saw fear. Not the kind of fear that came from being caught, the kind of fear that came from knowing too much. He didn't resist as they stepped inside, securing the space. The room was bare, except for a duffel bag in the corner, a cheap phone on the nightstand, and an untouched takeout container beside it. He had been waiting for something, or someone. Martinez wasted no time. "We know you were at the Ferguson house the night Cheryl was killed," she said, watching his reaction carefully. "Your DNA was there. Your phone was there. The only thing missing is your explanation. So tell me, why were you there?" Kessler swallowed hard, his gaze flicking to the floor. I shouldn't be here," he muttered. "This was a mistake." Martinez took a slow breath, steadying her patience. "The only mistake you made was running. The longer you stay quiet, the worse this gets. So I'll ask again, why were you there?" For a moment he said nothing. The rain pounded against the roof, filling the silence between them. Then with a shuddering breath, he finally spoke. "Cheryl asked me to be there." The confession landed like a gunshot in the room. Martinez didn't flinch. "Why?" Kessler exhaled shakily, rubbing a hand over his face. "Because she was scared," he said, his voice cracking under the weight of his words. "She knew something was coming. She just didn't know when." The pieces snapped into place one by one. The burner phone, the secret messages, the missing money. Cheryl Ferguson had known she was in danger, and she had brought Kessler in as her last line of defense. Martinez pressed forward. "Were you supposed to protect her?" He nodded slowly. "She didn't trust the police, didn't think anyone would believe her if she said she was afraid. So she hired me." His voice dropped lower. "I was supposed to be watching, to step in if things got bad." Martinez's pulse quickened. "Then why is she dead, Ryan?" His eyes shut tightly as if trying to block out the memory. "Because I was too late." The room went deathly silent. Martinez didn't speak, waiting for him to continue. Kessler's voice was barely a whisper when he spoke again. "I got there before it happened. I was outside, waiting, just like she asked. And then I heard them arguing. It was bad. I knew I needed to step in, but then the shot." A shudder ran through him, his hands clenched into fists. "I ran inside, but by the time I got there, she was already on the floor. And his breath hitched. He was just standing there staring at her like he couldn't believe what he'd done." Martinez's heart pounded. "And then I panicked," he admitted, voice raw. "I grabbed the gun thinking, God, I don't know what I was thinking. Maybe I thought I could wipe it down, make it look like an accident. Maybe I just didn't want my prints on the doorknob. But I touched it. I shouldn't have, but I did." His eyes met hers, hollow and broken. "And then I ran." The weight of his words hung heavy in the air. The fingerprints, the tampered scene, the missing link in the timeline. Martinez's breath was steady, but her thoughts were racing. "So you didn't kill her?" His voice was barely audible. "No." Silence settled between them. The final piece of the puzzle had just fallen into place. Jeffrey Ferguson had pulled the trigger. Ryan Kessler had only been the witness. And for the first time since the case began, Martinez knew exactly how it had all happened. The courtroom was silent, a kind of silence that didn't just exist in absence of sound, but in the weight of something inevitable. The tension was thick, unspoken, pressing down on every person seated inside. The walls of the room, which had witnessed countless trials, verdicts, and sentences, now stood in judgment over one of their own. At the defense table, Jeffrey Ferguson sat motionless, his once commanding presence diminished, reduced to nothing more than a man waiting to hear his fate. Gone was the confidence that had once filled this very courtroom, the self-assurance of a judge who had delivered sentences with unshakable authority. His hands, which had signed so many judgments, were now clasped together, knuckles white, as if they alone could hold together the unraveling of his life. Detective Laura Martinez watched him carefully. She had seen men like him before, Powerful men who had spent their lives controlling narratives, shaping outcomes, bending justice to their will. But now Jeffrey Ferguson had no control. The system he had once served had turned against him, and there was nothing left for him to do but wait. The jury filed in, their faces unreadable. Every movement, every footstep echoed with finality. The foreperson held a single sheet of paper in his hands, the weight of it far greater than its physical form. The room held its breath as the judge turned to the jury. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" "We have, Your Honor." A pause, a heartbeat stretched into eternity. In the matter of the state of California versus Jeffrey Ferguson on the charge of second-degree murder, we find the defendant guilty. The word landed like a thunderclap. A collective exhale rippled through the courtroom, some in relief, some in quiet shock. Ferguson closed his eyes for the briefest moment before reopening them, but there was no fight left in them now. No objections, no outrage, no attempt to maintain the facade of a man wrongly accused. It was over. The gavel struck wood, echoing across the chamber. Justice had spoken. Martinez let out a slow breath. This was what they had worked for, what Cheryl Ferguson had deserved. But justice, when it came, was always too late for the ones who needed it most. Across the room, seated in the back, Ryan Kessler bowed his head slightly. He had been running for so long, but today there was nowhere left to run. He wasn't the guilty one, but the weight of his silence, of his failure to act in time, still hung heavy on him. The burden of witnessing something so terrible without stopping it would never fully leave him. And yet the truth was finally known. The lies, the misdirection, the manipulation. It was all stripped away now, laid bare under the unrelenting light of the justice system. Jeffrey Ferguson had killed his wife. That fact would not be erased, no matter how many years he had spent in power. But the question that remained, the one that would never have an answer, was this. Would Cheryl still be alive if she had left sooner? Would she have made it if she had fled before that night? Or had she been doomed the moment she dared to believe she could escape? The sentencing came weeks later, 25 years to life. For a man who had once sentenced others, now knowing that he would wake up every day behind the same bars he had once placed others behind, there was a cruel irony to it all. He would spend the rest of his life hearing the sounds of metal doors locking behind him, of corrections officers ordering him around, of time slipping away in a place where power meant nothing. But even with Ferguson gone, the damage he had done could never be undone. Cheryl Ferguson was not here to see justice. She had never been able to see the life she was trying to build, the freedom she had been reaching for. She had almost made it. Almost. And that was the real tragedy. Her story spread, not just as a high-profile murder case, but as a cautionary tale. People whispered about it in courtrooms, in advocacy groups, in quiet conversations between women who had felt that same fear and wondered if they too were running out of time. Cheryl had done everything she could. She had planned, she had sought help, she had tried to leave. And still, it hadn't been enough. Domestic violence advocates spoke of her case, of the way control didn't always come in the form of physical violence. It came in words, in fear, in power that silenced. She hadn't called 911 before. She hadn't left a trail of police reports, but she had been afraid, and that should have been enough for someone to believe her. In the weeks following the trial, some of her friends began speaking out. They told stories of the quiet moments of doubt she had confided in them, the times she had hinted at being trapped, of needing a way out. And yet, like so many others, she had stayed. Maybe because she thought she could handle it. Maybe because she thought he wouldn't actually hurt her. And maybe because she knew leaving was when she was most at risk. Martinez had seen it before. The statistics didn't lie. Women were most likely to be killed when they tried to leave. And Cheryl had walked straight into the most dangerous moment of her life, hoping she would make it to the other side. She hadn't, and she wasn't the only one. The courtroom emptied that day, but the echoes of what had happened inside would never truly fade. The case was over, but its impact stretched beyond the trial. This was not just the story of a man who had lost control. It was a story of power, of control, of fear that had been ignored until it was too late. Domestic violence wasn't always loud. It wasn't always bruises or screaming fights in public. Sometimes it was years of eroded confidence, of isolation, of psychological warfare that left a person feeling trapped long before any violence occurred. Cheryl Ferguson had tried to break free, but the system, the fear, the danger, it had all caught up to her first. Martinez walked out of the courthouse into the late afternoon sun, breathing in the fresh air that Cheryl never got to see again. The case was over, but the work wasn't, because there were so many more women out there. Some were planning their escape, some were convincing themselves they weren't really in danger, and some, just like Cheryl, had already waited too long. The next Cheryl was out there somewhere, and maybe, just maybe, this case would be the warning she needed to get out in time. Thank you for watching our video. Please subscribe, follow us, and leave a comment. It truly helps us keep bringing you gripping and thought-provoking true crime stories.